All right, so Crazy Stars, this is an old pattern. We wrote this pattern, what was it, 2008? 2003, long time ago, 20 years ago. So this was kind of a fun thing. And a lot of our earlier patterns, they were done because Brianna was this tiny little person who was sewing and was, you know, accuracy was a little bit different. And so it's like, well, that's okay. It can look like that. It can look like that. And in fact, we'll make it look like that. If you look at the stars, what they are is it's just your basic 8-point stars. And the reason it's called Crazy Stars is because you can see that the star points are not matched. We are not doing our typical half square triangles or flying geese. This is just, they can be thick. We're really not concerned about 1/4 inch seam allowances or anything like that. And in fact, the crazier they are, the better it looks, I think, because some people are not very crazy. And so then it doesn't look very different. And so then somebody will look at it and say, well, why they're almost close enough that it looks like they should be. Does that make sense? So you want it to be crazy enough that, like, look at this one. It is very obvious that nothing here was supposed to match. We've got a tall, skinny one, a short, fat one. You know, they're all very different. We might find one like this one over here from where I'm standing. Well, no. Okay, these are all pretty crazy, but if you end up with something where, you know, these are more kind of the same size, then I think personally it's, I don't want to say that it's not as cute, but you don't want somebody to think that that it was just inaccurate. You know what I mean? You want them to know that the intent was to make it kind of wacky. So anyway, so this is the block. You can see it's really just a 9 patch. And by now I think you all have the pattern. We're going to talk about these. So here's our 9 patch. And if you look at the sashing is also essentially a 9 patch, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we're going to look at this up close. This one over here is the baby stars. And so we talk about big stars and big star sashing and baby stars. And these are the babies. And it's just a size difference. And you can see when they're close to each other, the difference. Baby stars are kind of fun, but what happens is you have to make a whole lot more of them in order to make the quilt. Whereas these, you know, this is a 14-inch block here. So you don't have to make very many to grow your quilt pretty large. This is about a 9-inch block. Well, probably 8.5, probably. So the quilt size 40 by 50, an 8-inch block. And this one is 70 by 87, 14-inch block, and that's finished 14-inch. So the 9 patch units, which would be these background squares and these center squares for the baby, is 3-inch squares. For this one, these are 5-inch squares, right? The sashing strips here, this is 3 inches by 14 inches. And this one over here is 2 by 8 for these. And we'll look at these up close here in just a second. 9 patch centers are right here. And then the star points, we're talking about that. And then when it says the skinny star fabrics, it's really the sashing. And the reason that I didn't say that, I think our first version of this pattern, we called it the sashing and people were very confused. So instead we're calling it the fat stars and the skinny stars. So the skinny stars in here, that's your center, which in the baby stars, this is 2 inches. And I think these, we suggest you start with 2 by 5. So, and if you've cut all of your fabric up, that's great. If you haven't, you'll see where you might want to modify that just a little bit and play with those sizes just a little bit. And I'll show you when we start sewing. All right, so cutting directions and then piecing directions. So the piecing directions, again, pretty simple. And when we're cutting, I'm just going to show you one little thing about the cutting. When I was doing this, these were a bunch of fat quarters. And what I could do is in cutting my little baby stars here, I do have a baby quilt to make, actually a toddler quilt. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut my 3-inch strip. And once I've cut my 3-inch strip, I can then go ahead and cut my 3x2, 8 times 1, my last one. And then I can go ahead and cut my 3-inch center square. And I have just a little bit left over if I'm doing another square, or just in case I made a mistake, then I would have that. So this is what I need for my baby stars. And that's, again, to make the small ones. If you are making the big ones, then those measurements are 5-inch squares, and your star points are 3 inches by 5 inches. So same thing, I would just cut a 5-inch strip, but you're going to need a little bit more. So for a fat quarter, you would need 2 strips. When you cut your background pieces, you have your sashing strips. These were for the baby stars. These were 2x8, and then these were 3x3. Okay, so let's just set up what a 9 patch would be, right? So a 9 patch would be your 9 3-inch or 5-inch blocks. 5-inch if you're making big stars, 3-inch if you're making baby stars. I'm using batik, so that's why I'm not paying much attention to right or wrong side. So normally I'm very visual, so when I'm setting out a block, I would lay the whole thing out. So now that I'm making my 9 patch, I'm going to take out my center, use this for the next block, and put in a center 3-inch square. So there it is right there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my points on. So I know that these in my 9 patch, if we just look over here, these 4 outer corners are going to stay the same. I have the center, so I'm putting my star points here. So these are the star points that I cut. Now, the other funny thing is that we've made this quilt multiple times. I should have brought, we have a celestial one that we did. The whole background is dark blue with constellations and stuff. And so then all of the stars were silvers and pretty grays and even gold colors. And we mixed and matched all of the pieces. It's really, really pretty. So you can do all kinds of different things. I always look for a quilt that is fun, that you can mix things up a little bit. So I cut 8 of these, and there's the number of how many you would need for the whole quilt. But what you want to know is that there's 8 of these rectangles per star. So that's what I was cutting when I was cutting the blue. So what's going to happen is I'm going to put a point here and here, a point here and here, here and here, and here and here. So that's where the 8 pieces are used, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and grab one, and I'm just going to go and start sewing. So let me show you how you put these down. So ordinarily, when you are sewing a half square triangle, if that's what you're doing, you would have all of this measurement, right? And you would end up maybe drawing a line and drawing a line here. Your size would be just a little bit different. What we're really doing is we're just deciding, is this going to be kind of a short little edge, a tall little edge? You know, what's going to happen with this? So I'm just going to kind of decide where it is. I'm going to flip it over because I'm going to sew right here. Move my chair so I don't poke the dog too much. Sorry, honey. All right. And it might not make sense yet, but 1 second it will. So I'm just going to go ahead and put this here. Take my 1/4-inch seam allowance, and I'm just going to go ahead and sew. Can you see, Brittany, where I'm at? Mm-hmm. Let's sew that down. My iron is hot. Get this out of the way. And press that open. So now I'm going to take my other one, And maybe I want it to be fatter. Maybe I want it to be skinnier. Who knows? I'm just going to kind of lay it, just see, experiment a little bit. Lay that down. You can't do anything wrong on this. And the other thing is that since we're sewing first and cutting after, if something does happen and you get something, you know, wrong side up, or, you know, you didn't quite make the edge or whatever, you can just rip it out really quick and you're fine. All right, so I've got these. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this block. So what's really easy about trimming this block is I'm just going to flip it over. Let me get the rest of that pressed. All right. So when I flip it over, you can see exactly where to trim. So I actually have a smaller ruler here that I'm going to use. I ended up with kind of a pokey cutter, but I'm going to use it anyway. And I know that this is a 3-inch square, and I'm just going to go ahead and cut 2 sides at once. But all I'm really doing is I'm just lining it up right on that edge. Right on the edge right there. Put that up. And now what I have is this perfect, oh, sorry. This perfect 3-inch piece. I'm going to put this up. I'm just going to put these a little bit closer so it makes a little bit more sense. I'm going to do it again. Now I'm going to do this one. I'm going to do this one. Do the same thing. And again, it's just a square. So no worries. However, I'm picking it up right. It could be oriented any way. And again, I'm doing all orange pieces, but you could mix and match however you'd like to. It doesn't really matter. The most common mistake if somebody were to do that is to go, okay, well, I feel like I want it to be right here. And then they go ahead and sew. Well, then as soon as you press it, you see it's wrong, right? So you do have to kind of decide. I feel like I want it to go maybe about there, and then flip it over. Does that make sense? Because then I'm going to sew it and flip it back. And the rest of it, it doesn't really matter. You just have to make sure that you're actually going to, I mean, you can't go super crazy, but see where maybe you wanted to come all the way up. You just want to make sure that you stay, I would suggest about at least 1/4 of an inch, if not 1/2 an inch away. Because if you get all kinds of crazy and come way up, then what happens is it's not really a star point if the star comes clear up into the top, right? Because I really want, I really want to stay all the way off to the side. So if it comes up here and you end up with this blunt, you know, and in fact, this one is as close to a blunt as we get, but you want to stay far enough down so that there's a point and there's a point. But if you have a space in between, it makes it kind of cute. You know, they don't have to be, see, like right here, there's a little space in there and a little space in there. They don't have to touch in the center if you don't want them to. It doesn't make any difference. So that's what's so fun about it, is that you're just kind of playing a little bit. So for this one, I'm just going to lay this over here. I'm going to take both pieces, sew this down. And again, your the pieces that you're starting with, these little, whether you're starting with their 3-inch by 5-inch pieces or your 2 by 3 if you're doing the small ones, this is just so you have a place to start. If you wanted something different, if you had some weird pieces left over, you could do whatever. If you're concerned about the amount of waste and you wanted it to be thinner, you can do whatever. But what happens is that, sorry, I put a little crease in there. What happens is we always feel like we have to give you a spot to start with. And once you have played with it a little bit, you can modify that. So same thing, maybe I want this one to be super fat. Come over here, or maybe I want it to be kind of tall. Whatever you want. Totally doesn't matter. I'm going to do that. Don't overthink it. I tend to do that, but you're making a lot of stars. So it's not going to matter. And the last thing really that you want is for all of these stars to look the same. You know, that's the whole idea, is that they're supposed to be crazy stars. Okay, so I'm going to press that. And I press as I go, press the whole time. I think that we've talked, if you've taken classes from me before, we talk about this a lot, that the key to a successful quilt is quality fabric, careful seam allowance, and good pressing. Pressing is, I mean, if you've taken the time and you're doing accurate sewing, you want to make sure that your pressing reflects that, so that, you know, your piece is nice and flat. All right, so we're gonna put this one up. And keep in mind too, that there's another seam allowance, right? Because we're gonna end up sewing this 9 patch together. So what will happen is there will be the tiniest little space here. And there probably will also be a space in this one. So maybe this one, maybe I'm gonna overlap those a little more. And again, I'm already overthinking it because that's kind of what I do, but that's all right. I'm going to sew both of these on both of these. You do have to come all the way out. So if I flip this one over, you do have to come all the way out, because otherwise, if something happened and you ended up there, you can see you're going to have a hole in your star point. You can see, so let's look at the difference. So here's one. So I sewed them on and then I trimmed it. So all is well. I've got my nice little points there. I want you to look at this one. So kind of like Brenda's, only not quite. So see up there, I didn't quite make it all the way to the end. However, what will happen is I know I've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance here when I sew my 9 patch together. So I'm not ripping that out. I went ahead and cut it, trimmed it, all was good, because I know that that little blunt point, I'm still going to end up with a nice point on that. So I'm letting that one go. All right, so here's my last 2. I'm going to position them where they go, to be here and here. And you can move them around, you know, a little bit if you think that you've got too many skinny points on one area and a big point somewhere else. Move them wherever you want to. And then now it's time to go ahead and sew your 9 patch. So when I sew a 9 patch, or when I sew, I do like to just work off of my table. So I'm going to carry it over there. The one thing that I will do wrong is I will turn a block as I'm sewing, and all of a sudden I'll get the whole thing done and my points, you know, will be like that or something, right? And so what I do is I work off of the table next to me. So I'm just going to carry it over on my ruler. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this whole seam together. So I'm going to flip this over, and it doesn't matter. I don't know why I'm starting on this side versus that side. It doesn't really make any difference. It's just what I decided. And I don't pin on this just because it's only 3 inches. And I oftentimes will fuss from the time I get to the table to the sewing machine. And I'm going to stop at the end with my needle down. And in a FOF, when I stop with the needle down, my foot pedal came up just a little bit, which is kind of nice. I'm going to take my next one, right sides together, and get it up here, and then fuss with it and just make sure that it's nice and even. Butt that right up next to the other one, and sew that one. Stop right at the edge with my needle in the, open this up. And then what I have, because I had kind of butted those together, it's almost like they're pinned right there, right? So now I'm going to do the same thing and sew on the other side. What I'm going to do, and that's why I put it on my little ruler, is I'm just going to turn this around. I'm right-handed. So I'm going to just turn that little guy around. Everything is still in the same place where it's supposed to be. I'm going to do the exact same thing. Lay this over. Now, if I'm doing that 14-inch block, if I'm doing big stars instead of little stars, same idea. I'm just going to have to be a little bit more careful. So I might have to fold up this bottom one to get a big 14-inch block from here to my sewing machine. So I'm just going to hold that up for just a minute. park my glasses back down, and then do the same thing. So I'm just going to fuss with this for a minute, get it right where it needs to go. And so now what has happened is I have my 9 patched together. Everything is in exactly the same spot that it should be. And it's like they're like pinned together, right? So I don't have to do anything. So I still personally not pressing yet. You could press, but sometimes, you know, if you're confused about which way it's going to go, this way, nothing is falling apart. And again, these are the little squares, but the big squares, it would still be the same thing. All you're going to do is flip that over, and I'm going to look at that. And I always, I just make sure that it goes to the dark. And so my center is going to come in, my outside is going to go out, and then you can see, can you see that? So I have my perfect nestled seams right there, and they're right where they should be because of that little tag of thread, right?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
You can see it? Okay. So now going to, again, fuss with it for a second. And that's why, you know, I pin at different places in different things. Borders always pin, always. But for little block things like this, I kind of fuss a little bit while I'm sewing. And so I tend to not pin as much, but do what makes sense to you. The other time that I'll pin is if I'm pinning because I feel like all of those pieces need to make it accurately to my sewing machine. So, you know, I'm not fussy about pinning. I feel like you want to. All right, so now I'm just going to do the same thing, flip this one over, and again, it's like it's been pinned. I've got these in, these are coming out. I've got my little nestled spots right there. So I'm going to go ahead and set it down. This will give me a chance to fuss for a minute. Okay, so that's it. Now I press. So now what I'm going to do is I am a best press fan. If you guys use the mister, I like that because did you see how that came out? Were you ready to be able to see that? Did you see it? It's really nice. We can even start on this side and I can spray it again. See that? So you don't use as much best press and you don't have anything that comes out in like a glob. So I'm just going to go ahead and press everything. And I always press both sides of my blocks. I like my seams to lay where they're supposed to, even though no one sees that part. And then I press the other side to make sure that all of the seams are open so that my block size is the right size. You can see in something like this, it isn't as much of a big deal, but oh, this is a perfect example. So see right here, can you see up close on that one, Brittany? Mm-hmm. So see how that looks like it's pressed? If I didn't press the front side, see that? There's a whole extra 1/8 of an inch in there. And an 1/8 of an inch might not seem like very much, but when you're piecing a block and maybe there's a different block where you have maybe, you know, 6 seams, if you're off by an 1/8 of an inch, that top of that block would be off by almost an inch by the time you got the block done. So that's why I always press my seams open to make sure that my block is the right size, assuming that I've got my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I spend as much time pressing probably as I do cutting because it's important to make sure that my blocks end up the right size. All right, so that is my little star. And so I'm not sure that I got super crazy on my points. I really didn't, but you can see kind of what happens. And so you might want to change them up a little bit. And that's why too, when you're doing your crazy stars, if you decide that these little 2 inch by 3 inch, maybe you want to do them a little bit longer and really go all the way up. Maybe you want a bigger piece or a longer piece that will go, you know, up farther and be thicker or thinner, whatever you'd like. You can kind of mess around with these just a little bit to get the size that you want. So you'll make as many of these as you want to. And if you look up close, so let's look at some of these. Look at this one, kind of a wacky one. So just depending upon where you put them, you might get a square done and say, ugh, I don't think I like that one. Totally doesn't matter. When you look at this quilt all together, you can see that that's what makes it interesting, is that you've got super skinny, super big. They're all very different. And so it makes it extremely obvious that that's what the plan was for them to be wacky. All right. So as you're doing those, so let's talk about the sashing then. So we've got this one, and I like to work off of a design wall or the floor or a big table, you know, whatever works for you. It's nice because then you have a little bit of a visual so that as you are piecing your blocks, it can help you to make decisions about color and where the next ones are going to go. If you're going to do purple next or whatever. So I'll lay things out. I used to do it more on the floor, but there's something about cats and quilting that is not good. We used to call it the kitty cat Olympics course whenever a quilt was on the floor. They would be napping in the other room, opposite end of the house. And as soon as the quilt was on the floor, everyone was up and awake. All right, so you can lay those out. So then what happens with your sashing, right, is your sashing is going to go in between your blocks. Here, one would go down here. And then I guess it would be easier if I had this one pieced. I should have thought of that, and I should have made a couple ahead of time. Let me squeeze these together a little bit. So let's say this is going to be our purple one. Okay. Okay, can you see that? That's not too. So we have sashing, sashing, sashing. And technically in the quilting world, of course, this is our cornerstone. These are our sashing blocks. But what's happening if we look over here is that here's our blocks. Here's that sashing. Here's the cornerstone. Here's the sashing. Here's the sashing. So the reason you kind of want to be planning it is because, you know, I'm going to do, I know that this pink star right here, I'm going to do my cornerstone, do my star points, my star points, my star points, my star points, put it back up on my design wall, back on the floor, back on the bed, whatever it is that you sew off of. And then I'm going to make my other decisions and know, oh, here is going to be this one. This is my cornerstone. I'm going to put my star points, my star points, my star points, my star points. And then you keep kind of building as you're going, so that you kind of know where you're doing it and where you're stopping. And if you're deciding that this one is going to be your corner one, you can see I have no star points over here, none over here, right? Does that make sense? All right, so we're going to start with this one. So what's happened is you can see that we cut these a little bit different. So your skinny stars, and again, we call them skinny stars just so that it made sense what it was, fat stars and skinny stars. And so this is a little bit different because we kind of wanted these to come into the edge. And, you know, I'll mention something else too. This is just a fun thing anyway. If you decided that you wanted to do this for another quilt, maybe there's something and you have some other kind of an I Spy quilt or just a big focus block or something else, and you kind of wish that you had something a little more interesting, you can do this little sashing treatment on anything, whatever the block is here. It's kind of a fun thing to do. So again, these are 2" by 5" for the skinny stars on the baby one. You could do them longer, you can do them whatever you want. This was just a starting point so you know what to start with. We're going to do exactly the same thing. So I'm going to take this, lay this out. The only thing is I'm just going to go a little bit farther. So I'm going to lay that out, go to the sewing machine, and press it open. And I press every time. You might feel like you can just finger press that. And if you feel like you can finger press and you're accurate, then, you know, again, we just tell everybody whatever gives you the best results. If you feel confident with what's happening, then, and this one, I think I'm just going to make a little bit chubbier. So I'm just going to come down, press this open. All right, so kind of the same idea, right? So it just looks a little bit weird. We've got a little bit of overhang. I'm going to flip it over. And, oh, sorry. And then using my ruler, using whatever you want, using scissors if you want to, it doesn't matter. You're just going to trim off using that base piece that in this case is 2 inches by 8 inches. And you're using that as your measurement for your sashing piece. So there's my little skinny star points. Put that up there. So it's going to go right there. That's going to go right there. I'm going to do one more. So this one, of course, this one was different. I had you cut 2-inch by 5-inch pieces to start with. That's what all of these are. This one, remember, was what, 6.5 or 7. So it looks a little different. So let's come over here again and let's look at some of these. Look at these long ones. You can tell these were not 5-inch sections. These were super long. These two were long. And even in the center, when you're doing the opposite side, so these were shorter. And even over here, you know, some of these, let's look over here. Here's a good example on the bigger ones where they've come all the way up and they've touched. One's overlapping the other one. And look at this option. If you're doing all kinds of colors for your star points. See, and look at that, you know, that's a huge overhang for those. So they don't have to come right to the point like these are. You really can just keep overhanging. And look at these, almost most of these, they kind of touch, not all of them do. But it's really varied depending upon how you're putting it together and what decisions you make. There's no real pattern. I mean, there's a pattern, but the rest of that, it's you know, whatever you feel like you'd like. So we'll just keep going. So I'll sew more skinny stars on here. So those stars, and then I would just keep building, building, building. So just like this one, however many stars you want, however many sashing pieces you want. If you had a million 6-inch squares from a previous project and you're never going to turn that into anything else, these could be 6 inches. It doesn't matter. Just make sure that once you've pieced that block, you know what that size needs to be for your sashing, because we know that this is now an 8-inch block, which is why this sashing piece is 8 inches, right? And even that 2 inches, that's just the size according to me. You could even make your sashing, you know, a little bit different if you want to. So it doesn't really matter. And we think that for really all of our patterns, you know, we did the math, we figured things out, but really making it personalized and make it work for the fabric that you have and the person you're making it for makes it really nice. So, so for this particular one, I think that there's 16, no, there's 20. So this size, if you were to make it the way that the pattern suggests in terms of what you've cut, you will make 20 of the little fat ones. And then you have your sashing here. I think there's a dozen, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. No, yeah, a dozen. So there's a dozen skinny ones and 20 of the bigger ones. If you're doing the big stars, you've got a dozen of the big stars and you only have 6 of the sashing stars. And again, that's the whole thing, right? When you're making a quilt, if you make a big block, you don't have to make very many before your quilt is all of a sudden done. If you're making little blocks, you have a lot of sewing to do. So it just sort of depends on whatever you'd like to do. But you could see these, since these are 5-inch squares that we started with, you really could do some fussy cutting if you wanted to. You could add all kinds of things. And even for the borders are just the math and what we decided to do. So for this particular one, we did do 2 borders on this one. This one we also did, well, this one's really 3, but 2 colors, right? So we did, and these are the directions in your pattern. I think that was a 3-inch, just a tiny little bit of your background, and then another 3-inch. And then we did our binding out of the same color that we did our border out of, but you can do anything you'd like for your binding. So let's talk about noodles. Noodles are super, super fun. There was a few years there where we put noodles on, I think, every single quilt that we made. They might be called something else. If somebody else makes them, we just call them noodles. And again, I was sewing with somebody who was 2003. How old was she? 7 years old. Let's do the math. She was 7 years old. She made millions of noodles. We had jars of noodles. She was addicted to making these. And so all this is a strip of leftover fabric. So what's kind of fun is that when you're, and if you look in here, you can see these were all of the colors that we used in the stars. So what we did was we took a strip of fabric and we cut them, I think we cut them 1.5 inches. Yeah, 1.5 inches wide. So whatever leftover pieces, we would cut 1.5 inches wide, and then we would fold them together, right sides together, and we would sew that 1/4 inch seam allowance, which left us with basically 1 inch, right? And then we used this thing, and I think it was called the tube turner, and it comes, there's 3 different sizes. So you can do a big tube, a medium-sized tube, or a little tube. If you are anybody who does spaghetti straps or you do a lot of bags, you probably have that already. It's like, I don't know, $15, $16. And what you do is you take your little tube, and I should have brought mine with me. I totally forgot about the noodles. But what you do is once you've sewn that, you put this over the top of your tube, and then you take this little wire that you pop up through there. It grabs the end of it and you pull it through. There's all sorts of different brands of tube turners on the market. Your other thing is you can take a safety pin it to the end and push it through. If you do it that way, you will not make a million noodles because it will not be fun. But if all you're doing is popping this on a tube, twisting and pulling it through, it takes just seconds to do it. So, and we had all of these sizes. And then when you have your border on, all you're going to do is you just fold them. You fold them, and you can see some of them are short, some of them are long, some of them are medium. It doesn't really matter. And you lay them all down. So you just put them all up and you lay them all down. Put your next border on top of that, right sides together. And then you do pin, because then as you're sewing, you're watching to make sure that all of those ends are in there. And so this is just a little 3-dimensional thing on the end of on the border of your quilt. So we've done prairie points this way. There's all kinds of little 3-dimensional things, but noodles were always our favorites. And then we made a lot of baby quilts this way, where at first what we did was we put the toy on the noodle and realized that was totally wrong, because sometimes you want to take the toy off and you have to wash it or whatever. So then we realized those little carabiners, which, 20 years ago, those little carabiners were not everywhere, but you could put little plastic things, and that way you can attach a little toy to the corner of it if somebody's trying to crawl. So anyway, we did put a little disclaimer because we worried if somebody got their arm through a noodle. So, I'm not entirely sure that they are, we had them for all of the babies, but I don't know. We would probably want to be a little careful, but anyway, so my little PSA about noodles, but we love noodles. Noodles make a huge difference on pillows, quilts, borders. This one is quilted with glow in the dark thread, which is kind of fun. I was going to ask Eliza if she knew that before she left, but we'll have to, it's kind of a fun thing. And so because of that, that thread broke a lot. So it doesn't have a lot of heavy quilting on it. So all I really did is I just kind of, in sort of a wacky line, not a straight line at all, I just went around all of the stars. And all I did is I went around these stars. There's really no quilting in any of this at all. The other thing is that when you do the noodles, you do have to put, can you see right there? See that line right there?
Mhm.
Can you get close enough up? You do have to kind of stitch that. You have to put some sort of a quilting line in there. And even if you wanted to do a straight line, it kind of helps those noodles to lay where they're supposed to lay, because keep in mind that in your seam allowance there, it's not just this back border and that border. You've got those edges of those noodles. And what can happen is that it can just look like messy hair. And you don't really want the noodles. I mean, if it looks like this, it looks kind of funny. Does that make sense? And so the way to get them all to lay this way is to stitch that down. Of course, those don't, because of the way that it's hanging, but it is kind of nice that they all lay that way. So you want to just quilt that edge there a little bit. And that's all the quilting that's on there, is a little bit here, a little bit here, and then just a little stipple in the border. All right. This one is way heavier quilting because, again, just made differently. So we just did some swirls in there. Thanks for taking the class with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for watching our video. We invite you to leave a comment, hit the like button, or better yet, subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode. You can also visit our Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or Pinterest pages, or find all of those things and our online store at fabricpatch.net.